So I'm Melissa. I'm a reporter based here in Chicago, and I write about immigration and labor. Mica Rosenberg, who you'll hear from in a minute, she's based in New York, and she writes about immigration kind of from the national perspective. And our colleague who isn't here right now and may or may not join us later, her name's Perla Trevizo, and she's based out of Texas and writes for ProPublica and the Texas Tribune. And the three of us, wound up working together starting in March of this year on a project that I don't think any of us exactly saw coming. And just to get started, for some of you might not be super familiar with what we're going to talk about, but we want to share a video that our colleagues in the video team made. It's very short, just a minute.
These were a bad group of people that were really bad.
These people need to be locked up as long as they can.
No va a ser tan fácil de olvidar la pesadilla que pasamos.
Me puse a ver la foto que publicaron en El Salvador y lo reconocí.
¿Por qué nos sacan de Estados Unidos de la manera que nos sacan? Sin tener récord criminal en el país.
Es un dolor más grande que hay, saber que suyos están allá en ese lugar, secuestrados.
Familias de los venezolanos que están detenidos en la mega cárcel de El Salvador protestaron.
Tras de esos muchachos vemos madres, padres, esposas, hijos, mucha persona que sufrió.
Para dormir me está costando bastante.
No pensaba en más nada de que era la libertad, que iba a salir de ese infierno.
No se van a olvidar nunca lo vivido. Lo que exigimos hoy en día, justicia.
Okay, hopefully that was visible. Okay. Mica, do you want to share how we got started on this?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having us. As Melissa said, I'm Mica Rosenberg. I cover immigration nationally for ProPublica, and all three of us from different states and different perspectives have been covering immigration for quite some time. And when the new Trump administration came into power, we were in some ways kind of waiting to see what he was going to do differently from his first term and where he was going to go further. And so on day one, we got a glimpse into sort of the macro plan for the administration, where there was a flurry of executive orders that were issued. And Perla and I really took a look at this first story that we wrote that sort of went through meticulously. We created a database of all the executive orders and all of the policies that were mentioned in there, some of them sort of vaguely or obtusely, just referring to particular like statutes, and some of them more explicitly, and really broke it down to, he's tried this before, but some of them had never been tried before, and some of them were really pushing the boundaries of what was possible under immigration law, and really were sort of pie in the sky with some of the immigration hardliners in the administration. And so in that, we were able to see which things were going to be new, and almost right away we started seeing some of those things being implemented. And one of them was declaring an invasion at the border and talking about ways in which the executive and the presidency could wield extraordinary power in immigration in ways that hadn't been tried before. And another one was, which we saw pretty soon, contemplating sort of going back to this law in this came a little bit later, but that it was presaged by that invasion declaration, invoking a law from the 1700s saying that Venezuelan gangs were enemies of the state, and it sort of fit with this invasion language. And so part of that, we started seeing some of the first actions where the Trump administration was targeting Venezuelans and first sent them to Guantanamo Bay, which is something that we had never seen before. Obviously, Guantanamo Bay is known as a place where the 9/11 terrorists were held, this notorious international prison in in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. It had held migrants there, but most of them had been intercepted at sea and had never sort of touched US soil. And this was the first time that the administration was sending people from the US to Guantanamo Bay. So that first kind of pricked up our ears, and Perla and I started digging into that and trying to find out who the people were who were being sent there. And almost immediately became clear that while the administration was saying that, you know, all of these people were the worst of the worst, we looked into their backgrounds and found that, you know, many of them had not committed crimes in the US, and didn't sort of fit with the characterization of what the administration said. So that was sort of setting the stage in the playbook. Then we saw the administration taking another step of intercepting people at the border who were applying for asylum, and you know, instead of having them go through a process where they could, you know, try and make their case in court for asylum, they were immediately being put on planes and deported to Panama and Costa Rica. And in Panama specifically, we found that sort of through the International Organization of Migration and the Panamanian government, they were being held in a detention camp in the jungle and sort of not able to leave there for several weeks. So that was another unprecedented thing. And so we were sort of primed for sort of what that the administration was prepared to take further and further steps. And then, you know, the middle of March came around, and March 15th happened. And so meanwhile, you know, while we were reporting on this, Melissa was in immigration court looking at some of the cases. And so, you know, that's kind of how she came into the story, and she can tell you that part of it.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that this story here in the bottom right-hand corner was published March 12th, which is interesting. So the next day, or not the next day, a couple of days earlier, I'm based here in Chicago, and I was trying to sort through like, what the heck am I gonna be doing here? Because there was a lot of crazy things happening, kind of one after another. And I'd been observing court, which you can do, and there's different dockets, like for the regular folks who are kind of out in the world and showing up to court on their scheduled days, and then for the people who are in detention, and those court hearings are virtual. And I started just attending virtual hearings. And on March 10th, I was doing my thing and just kind of observing immigration court virtually. And there's this really fascinating situation that I hadn't seen before after a few weeks of watching, where like the very early in the morning, this very excited, anxious seeming younger attorney kept popping into court and kind of interrupting, not interrupting, but just popping in and saying like, "Hey judge, like I'm really trying to get my guy on the line, but like he keeps getting transferred and he keeps getting transferred, but I'm gonna try to get him on the line." And his client was in a jail in Laredo, Texas, and he had just been transferred there. He'd been transferred and transferred and transferred like many times over the weeks right before. And his attorney was having a hard time getting a hold of him. And like all day he kept talking about this client. And like by the end, like I think maybe 6 hours after I first saw this man pop up on screen, like his client finally comes on. And at this point, I'm like, who is this guy? And like right away, it was different. Most of the hearings it was a bond hearing where like a judge is determining whether the person in detention has the right to bond out while their case kind of unwinds. And all of the bond hearings that I had seen up until that point, like they kind of followed this particular script, like where the judge asked a couple of questions and then made a decision, and it was like done within 2 minutes. But this hearing ended up stretching like an hour. And the guy who was on the screen, his name's Albert, and you could see the tattoos that he had on his body, even like from the screen. He had been detained during the Biden administration last November. He was a guy who lived in Chicago. He lived like in the back of the yards area with his girlfriend in a little apartment, and he worked as a DoorDash driver and at night, and he worked selling concessions at Wrigley Field, which I thought was really interesting. He had been convicted of shoplifting a year earlier. He took a bunch of items from a Walmart in Skokie, and he pleaded guilty. He served a couple of days in jail, and that was it. It was a misdemeanor conviction. But the reason he ended up coming onto ICE's radar and getting detained in November didn't have to do with the conviction. It had to do with those tattoos on his body. He had a tattoo of an angel holding a gun, I think on the side of his neck. And he had apparently made this video of himself that he posted on TikTok in which he is dancing to an audio clip that plays behind him that says, kind of like in a boogeyman sort of ooh voice, it says, the Tren de Aragua is going to get you. The Tren de Aragua, this Venezuelan gang who we ended up writing about, is going to get you. And that video prompted the federal investigators, or sorry, ICE to look into this guy, detain him. And during the course of that whole hearing, he was ultimately denied bond, but the government kept alleging that this man was a gang member due to this video and his tattoos. So that was March 10th. You know, Mica and Perla are doing these stories. On March 15th, the Trump administration sends more than 230 Venezuelan men to this prison in El Salvador called Secot. And I maybe naively didn't quite think that Albert would be one of those guys because he was somebody who I'd seen in court, who I kind of had already been interested in as for a possible story. And a couple of days later, when his final asylum hearing came up on March 20th, the guy didn't show up in court. And it was at this hearing that the lawyer kind of like desperately turns to the government attorney, the ICE attorney, and asks like for information about where he is. And at that time, the government attorney said that they had no idea where he was. And, you know, just as soon as that second hearing ended, I got on a call with Mica and Perla to talk about what I had just seen. And Mica very quickly, through her sourcing, was able to confirm that this man was among those sent to Secot.
And so this was a really chilling development for us, you know, sort of seeing this happening in real time to somebody who Melissa had been following and who was plainly in the middle of their asylum case, was about to have their full asylum hearing heard. And what that means is that somebody who is waiting, you know, to make a claim that they're afraid and they want to stay in the country, that process was completely cut off. And so going back to that original law that I mentioned, the law from the 1700s, the Alien Enemies Act, basically what that did with the presidential proclamation was sort of short-circuited the whole immigration process and said, you know, once we determine that somebody belongs to this gang, Tren de Aragua, which we have declared is invading the country and is an enemy of the people, they no longer sort of need to go through the regular immigration process, which is really unprecedented. You know, meanwhile, at the simultaneously while this is happening, as these men were getting deported, the ACLU was in court. They had heard sort of some of the transfers that Melissa was talking about, that lawyer was seeing behind the scenes, all of the Venezuelans being moved down to Texas, and they had heard that there was a possibility that they would be deported. They went to court, tried to get a judge to stop it, and a judge ordered them to stop the deportations. But at that point, it was a verbal order. The government said it was too late. The planes were in the air, and they landed in the tarmac at this prison, which I'm sure many of you have seen the images of, you know, on broadcast, is one of the most notoriously, you know, maximum security, brutal conditions prison in the Western Hemisphere. You know, we had done a lot of reporting about the conditions there. And so basically at this point, you know, there was this question of who are these men? We know Albert, we know is one of them. We had seen this pattern of the men who had been sent to Guantanamo, which really didn't sort of fit the bill of, you know, the characterization, the broad characterization that all of them were the worst of the worst. And so we started saying, how can we find out who these people are and what the claims that the government is saying about them, how much can we believe what is being said about them? And so we started calling around, and sort of quickly through our source calls, we found out that there was a group of Venezuelan journalists who were attempting to do the same thing. and sort of leading them. They were, independent investigative journalists in Venezuela, which is a difficult job to have. And kind of leading the effort was somebody who we had already been in touch with and we knew, named Rona Risquez, who is one of the sort of world's leading experts on Tren de Aragua. She wrote a book about it, has a lot of kind of background information about how the gang came about. It started in as a prison gang inside Venezuela and sort of grew from there. It was gained power by extorting many of the migrants who were leaving. There was millions of people leaving Venezuela because of the economic and political situation there. And this gang was taking advantage, often extorting those migrants along the route. And there was concerns in the United States that members of the gang were sort of making it all the way up to the US-Mexico border. So once we found out that Rona and her team of investigative reporters were trying to do the same thing, we quickly started talking to them about it and found out that we had sort of simultaneously both started collecting our own databases about each of these men. There had been a preliminary list that was published by CBS News, just of the names, and we had independently confirmed those, gotten our own additional information about them, and we're trying to look up everything about them, all of their criminal histories, their records, finding their families. And Rona and her team were doing the same thing. So we said, let's join forces and do this together. We can look on the US side, find all of the criminal records from the US, all of the information that we can do in their court records, their immigration cases. You guys can help focus on finding their international records because maybe they had committed crimes outside of the US, in Venezuela, in Chile, in many of the countries where Venezuelans had lived, maybe outside of Venezuela. And then together we can, look for their family members, find out more about what happened. So that's how we came together. And it turned out to be a really unique partnership because of the way that we were able to leverage both, all of the knowledge in the US and this international knowledge. Was how we were able to gather so much information.
And I'm having a hard time doing a full presentation. Let me see if this, whatever. Here's some screenshots of like what the database looks like. I realize it's probably there, you can't look very closely, but we wound up having a massive database. We worked in Google Docs. So that original list from CBS had 238 names. So kind of internally, we called it the 238 Project. And those names might have had typos in them, etc. And Mica was able to obtain kind of additional information through sourcing on the men, and kind of the most important data I think she was able to get included their dates of birth. And using that, we were able to scour court records all over the country, kind of focusing on areas where we knew a lot of immigrants from Venezuela had come, like Chicago or New York or Denver. And we wound up having these spreadsheets and we worked with a lot of people internally at ProPublica, including a researcher named Gabriel, who did a lot of the FOIAing of the different court systems or police departments to kind of see whether it was true what Trump was saying, that these guys were all a bunch of sick criminals who deserve what they got. And then we also spent a lot of time on social media. Perla and I, in particular, were what's the right word? We stalked hundreds of families and individuals on Facebook and TikTok. You'll see here on the right an image of a woman who's a mom, and this was from a video that had been posted. I don't remember if it was on TikTok or or Facebook, but these moms in Venezuela were making these really sad, desperate videos, like calling for the release of their sons. They were begging the presidents of Venezuela, of the US, of El Salvador, for any help in getting their sons out. And we'd find these videos, or we'd find news reports in Venezuela or different countries and try to reach out to the families to learn more about the men. And I think at the beginning we weren't super sure what we were going to do with all of this. But ultimately, like the information we got from records, from the families, from the men's attorneys, we were able to turn into little stories about each one of them. Oh, Micah, can you talk about the next one?
Yeah, so one thing that was another sort of set of information that was in the data that we were able to obtain was sort of how the government internally had classified the men, whether or not they had criminal convictions, whether or not they had whether or not they had pending criminal charges, and whether or not they were non-criminals, meaning they would only have potentially immigration violations. So one of the things that was pretty revealing about that is we were able to show that the actual number of the men who were all under one umbrella as the worst of the worst had actually been convicted of crimes in the United States, and that an even tiny smaller percentage of that, or a handful of them, had violent criminal histories. But with all of the research that we were talking about before, we were able to take that further and actually find the documentation of all of the crimes or most of the crimes that were committed, and that mostly matched what the government had in their records. And so a lot of the convictions were for things like what Albert had done, shoplifting, traffic tickets, other things that were crimes, but certainly weren't the crimes that were being described broadly by the administration. Then the administration had said, well, in court, in this court case that I mentioned that was trying to challenge their deportation, the administration said, well, the crimes that they committed in the US isn't comprehensive of, these are potentially dangerous people who came from outside the country. They may have committed heinous crimes elsewhere. And so that's where our Venezuelan partners came in. And we were similarly able to show that, yes, among them, there were some that had serious crimes, but it was a small number of the entire group. And so we thought that it was important to detail one by one what each of them had done. And so our first story was kind of the overview of these of what the government actually knew about them before they were deported. And I think the context here is important because there is in the country, there's an immigration law. If you're convicted of a crime, you can be deported. In the past, it had been difficult for the United States to deport the large number of Venezuelans who had recently been coming across the border because the government of Nicolas Maduro wasn't taking them back in large numbers. But at this time, Venezuela had started taking back some Venezuelan deportees. And so most of these men, when they were getting on the plane, maybe they had a conviction, maybe they had been ordered deported, they got on the plane thinking they would be sent home. They never imagined that they would be sent to this prison in El Salvador, which, Perla did a lot of this research as well, has, before these men, you'll see in the end, were released, nobody had ever really been released from this prison. And it was one of the largest prison complexes in a country which had a series of documented human rights violations inside their prison system, deaths and other abuses, which the previous U.S. governments had called El Salvador out for that. And so this deal was really unprecedented in that way. So even though the idea was that some of these men might have been slated for deportation, it was never thought that they would be sent to this prison where essentially the administration at that time was saying they deserve to stay there for the rest of their lives.
And you know, and it's worth noting, like a lot of these guys, dozens of these men had been, you know, detained by the government and deported to this prison before, and they never stepped foot in the US as free people. They were detained when they came to the border with appointments with the government to try to make their asylum pitches. Like the guy in the photo, he's one of many who never even made it into the US, but he was called a criminal and sent to El Salvador. And he was like a soccer coach in Venezuela. And I mean, the next story we did was about how what we were finding is that these people were not people who had come here illegally and were like absconding from the law. A lot of them had come, like I said, with an appointment at the border through a program that Trump got rid of on day one called CBP1 with a cell phone app. Um, Many were in the middle of their immigration cases or had asylum claims that were pending, like Albert, who was literally 5 days from his final asylum hearing. I'm going to show very quickly kind of the story we did on that. Um, Wonder if I can't show the audio. Oh.
Me detuvieron simplemente por mi tatuaje. No fui Me detuvieron simplemente por mi tatuaje. No fui ningún delincuente.
So this man is Jose Manuel Ramos Bastidas. He had come to the border. He was detained at the border like a year before he was shipped off, and he spent months in detention. He never got to live in the United States. And early in the year after Trump came into office, as he was seeing kind of the stuff that Micah was talking about earlier, other Venezuelan men who had been in the same detention centers as him, like get shipped off to Guantanamo. He was freaking out that he was going to go there too. And he ended up having his wife record a video of him, like during a video call that they had with each other, kind of saying, like, I want you to make this record of me. Like, I'm afraid they're going to send me to Guantanamo. And like, what he didn't know is he was going to get sent to like somewhere maybe worse, like to a place where he was tortured. So we wrote a story kind of using all the reporting that we had to talk about this, about how these were people in the system. They were not like illegal immigrants absconding from the law. Micah, do you want to talk about the database and I'll show it while you talk?
Yeah. So basically after we did those first stories that were kind of based on our analysis of all the men, we ultimately produced a database of every single one of the initial 238 who were sent there on March 15th. And as Melissa said, they all had sort of small bios, their information about their family, what we were able to learn, and as well as their criminal history or non-criminal history as we found it.
And in these little bios, we, you know, through the reporting with the family, we learned like this guy here pictured Gavi, like his last name is Guerrero, which is, as I'm sure a lot of you know, a very common last name in Latin America for people who speak Spanish. But one of the main reasons he was tagged as like a Tren de Aragua guy is because the last name of the leader of the Tren de Aragua game is also Guerrero. And it's like, it was some of the stuff we learned was really absurd and we couldn't write full stories about it, but all of this kind of landed in this database that we made. And Micah, I think we published the database just a couple of days after the men were finally released from prison, right? And in July.
Mm-hmm.
And because we'd done all this work and talked to so many of the families, once the men were released, it was pretty easy for us to get a hold of them and talk to them. And like the video you saw earlier, we were able to document kind of their testimonies of what happened to them. And over and over, I think ultimately we've spoken with maybe 15 of the men. They have told us that they were tortured in prison, that they were beaten daily, they were humiliated. The guy I mentioned was a soccer coach in Venezuela, talked about how he was forced to kneel almost naked next to other men and like lick their backs for no reason other than that the guards could make them do that. So we wrote a story about this daily abuse and torture And the men are back in Venezuela, desperate to leave again because the economy there is still messed up, is as messed up as it was when they left. And Micah, Perla, and I are still reporting on Tren de Aragua and kind of this horrible program that we did. But I think maybe we can pause it there and take questions.
Okay. This is heavy stuff, man. For folks who are watching, you can, a few folks have already added their questions in the chat. You can go ahead and ask your questions in the chat as well, and we'll get to them in the order that we see them. And then, I have a few questions as well, but I'll start with one that we got early on, which is audience question. Do we have any idea how many employees of the federal government are watching Instagram and TikTok videos? Is this a separate digital investigations unit?
I can
if
maybe I'll start, Micah. I will I don't know if there's like any actual research on this, but I will say I made a TikTok video just a couple of weeks ago in Chicago. As we know, we're like in the middle of a operation, what is it, Midway Blitz or something. And I made a TikTok video in my neighborhood. I live in Belmont Craig, and just walking around saying like this thing's supposed to start. It's pretty fucking dead here. And the video was seen by like a couple 100,000 people, and among them were like people who work in the federal government doing work very close to what Micah and I are reporting on, who then reached out and said that they wanted to, they had seen the videos on TikTok and they wanted to talk. So some of them are there. We hope more come out.
Yeah, and I think from a more sort of operational standpoint, I don't have an exact number of how many, but we do know that, inside intelligence gathering, there is monitoring of social media of migrants. On the one hand, the Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, when they're sort of investigating people who are crossing the border, they sometimes do deep dives, sometimes the Border Patrol investigative units or Homeland Security investigations, they're looking into smuggling networks, transnational criminal organizations, and often, international smuggling groups are advertising their wares on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, Telegram, all of these platforms. And so they are, just as any investigation, they're looking there for those types of groups and messages. They're asking, I know that they'll ask migrants at the border about specific, smugglers who may be sort of talking about smuggling routes on those platforms. I know that from other reporting. And then, I think as you saw in Albert's court case, on the other side, when ICE may be trying to make a case to keep somebody detained or to flag them as a member of a gang, that's when they'll start doing sort of those investigations into their social media. Now we're seeing that more, for example, in the State Department and the USCIS unit, when people are trying to sort of sift through people's social media and profiles to deny their visas or revoke their visas, as we've seen in the beginning of the administration. So I think this is an active and evolving area where the government is looking.
I think you understood the question better than I did. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another audience question. So it's the focus of this reporting is, it looks like it's on a group of men. Did you do any work that was tracking the women or their families outside of those folks that you focused on in that 238 project?
I mean, this initial project was on the men because that's who the government imprisoned in El Salvador, although that wasn't their intention. I mean, and there were 3 planes of Venezuelans that were sent down to El Salvador on March 15th. And there were what, Michael, like 7 women on the plane?
There were eight women.
And like the government thought that they could send them there, the Salvadoran government. Like it was on the tarmac in El Salvador. The Salvadoran officials were like, oh, we can't take the women. And those women had to wait on the plane for the men to get off and, to get beaten to get off, including some women who were married to some of the men. And then they were like flown back to Texas. And I mean, one thing that we learned that we weren't able to report on is that, but some of the reporting has come out, but some of those women had children who were stuck in the United States. Like dad is in prison in Salvador, mom is deported to Venezuela. Eventually, they were able to deport the women to Venezuela, and they were separated from their kids for months. And like the family members in the US, they might have had kind of this precarious legal status. Maybe they had TPS, maybe they had asylum, but they were really scared because so did their relatives who were imprisoned or deported. And they didn't know how to get those children back to Venezuela safely. And like the lack of diplomatic relations between Venezuela and the US has made that really complicated, like to this day, for other women who are, I talked to a woman, a Venezuelan woman whose friend is still in prison in a detention center in Kentucky, and like her kid is like under the care of a babysitter in Chicago, and they're trying to figure out how to get this child connected to the family, but the mom is in detention. So I think there's a lot more reporting to do. This project focused on the men because they were the ones who were sent to prison, but it could have looked different had the Salvadoran government accepted the women at Secot.
Mm. Wow. It's hard to keep up, right? It's like the travesties keep piling up, and there's such an effect that happens from every action, right? It's terrible. Other question, how do you manage the privacy of the detainees? What sort of analysis went into analyzing the benefits versus harms of de-anonymizing? Because I think there are some names, like full names, that are in there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Micah, if we can both talk about
Yeah.
this.
I mean, it's a complex question that we discussed, often and regularly throughout the project. I think the starting point in some ways um, was made slightly easier because their names had been published by CBS. And, that was actually how a lot of the family members found out that their loved ones were in this prison. There was no way for them to communicate with these men. They just thought that they had totally disappeared. And so once their once their names had been published, that was kind of the first indication, and the families themselves started reaching out and trying to find out, what was happening. And, for that reason, some of them were very willing to sort of talk and identify that as we showed in those TikTok videos, many mothers and relatives themselves were sort of outing their sons as in prison or their relatives as in prisons. They're showing their photographs, showing their identity documents, saying, please, help me. So that sort of went into the analysis. And at the same time, there, the images that had come out from the Salvadoran government and the Trump administration, which was, reposted by them, were these sort of, almost propagandistic videos of the men being taken off the planes, having their heads shaved, putting on these sort of white uniforms, and with some of them with their faces, fully shown. And so that was another way that families were identifying their loved ones. So I think, where sort of the most difficult conversations that we had were the ones where we ultimately were able to speak to more than 100 family members and have conversations with them directly, let them know that we were planning on publishing this information about their loved ones. But there were the rest, who we weren't able to speak directly with their family. So I think, those were kind of the conversations where we said, as a whole, it's more, if we're going to identify some of them, we have to identify all of them in the interest of sort of the journalistic integrity of the project. But I don't know if you have more to say about that, Melissa.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard. I think the hardest part might have been, I mean, their names were out there, but whether they had committed a crime, whether like we had records that nobody else had reported. We were able to learn things that these men had never told their own families. Like Albert's mom, I talked to her a lot, Gladys, and she didn't know that her son had spent a couple of days in jail for shoplifting. And she's just like, gosh, maybe, like and I have kids. Like, I think we've all been young too. We've all done dumb things and maybe didn't tell our parents. So she kind of was like, well, maybe he did that, but that doesn't justify like this outcome. And that was typically what we heard from people. There's one case, it was also a Chicago case where the sister of one of the men who had pretty minor stuff like Albert, she was really angry that we were going to publish it, and she like said like, well, just keep his name out of it. And I was like, I'm sorry, like, we're not keeping his name out of it. Like, we can't do all of them on the list except for your brother. Like, that's that we either have to do all of them or none of them. And that was hard. Like, so we all talked about it. Like, when that kind of stuff came up, and it only came up, I think, that one time, besides our own kind of like, navel gazing and like wondering, are we doing the right thing? But we all talked about it at length over and over, and we decided that ultimately the Trump administration has cast a very like, I don't know, they've cast all of these men as the worst of the worst, as criminals, as animals. So it's just like the most horrific language that you could use. This and what we found was that that wasn't true. And like, but in order to show that, we had to show it like case by case. And so we believed it was more important to lay it all out, even if it made some people uncomfortable. And when we talked to a bunch of these guys after they got out of prison and talked to them, I mean, we've learned they've told us about crimes hadn't known that they committed, and we've updated the database. And they're like, yes, you know, I did X, Y, or Z thing, but I didn't deserve to have the shit beat out of me on a daily basis for 4 months in that prison. And it's like, okay. And so we've
And
we've included that. Go ahead, Micah.
Yeah, and I was just to say that I do, there, as I mentioned at the top, there were this sort of handful that had more serious crimes. As you can imagine, those were the ones who were less likely to be sort of out there, with their relatives putting their names out. But as we knew from our, Venezuelan reporting partners, a lot of those, some of those details of those crimes had, been reported on internationally. And so, we also took that into consideration, right? That we were able to find their names, sort of in international media coverage, related to these crimes. And so, that was also something we were thinking about when we were reporting this.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. So yeah, as journalists covering this topics, are there precautions that you take for safety? And I mean, I'm just kind of curious if there's ever been any kind of, yeah, pressures or intimidations that you guys have experienced, if you can share. And how do you defend or protect against that?
I don't know if I've had serious safety threats in the US, or I mean, even I don't think I've had really serious issues. I get a lot of racism. I get a lot of like sexism and just like really nasty stuff. That TikTok video I mentioned, I got a lot of just really nasty phone calls and voice messages that like I would play out loud and be like, oh my God, my kids can't listen to all these bad words. Like, but I don't think I've felt unsafe. And this not for this project, but in other projects when I find myself like in a physically like uncomfortable position or situation, I will like, do a friend finder with my editor, send him my address, like ask him to check in on me in like 30 minutes to make sure I'm good. And like all has been fine. Micah, have you dealt with this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I spent many years as a foreign correspondent in Latin America. I started my career in Guatemala and Mexico, and traveled all around Latin America, and been to Haiti and Honduras, and during political coups and natural disasters and all kinds of things. And so I feel like that the sort of the physical danger that I felt has been in those environments more than here. I mean, I think there's always sort of this back and forth of pressure campaign with if you're saying something that the administration might not agree with. But I do feel like that if you are presenting the facts and you're upfront with what you're doing, then it sort of it protects you in a way, because you're sort of backed up by the reporting. But that's not to say that there is a lot of danger in the world, for journalists. But I think that we're there are other people who are sort of more in danger than us, I think.
But it's a really like uncertain time. One of my colleagues in the Chicago office, Vernal Coleman, he's been looking at the VA for the past, few months. And he went and knocked on somebody's door, which we do as reporters. Like sometimes we try to call people or we email them or we message them, then we send them letters. And often people ignore us, especially if they work for the government. And so we will go to their homes sometimes if we think they're important enough and knock on their door and ask if they will talk to us. We'll leave little messages, etc. And Vernal did this apparently last week to somebody and at the VA, and he went to their house, whatever, knocked, etc. And then like the secretary of the VA like sends out a tweet about how Vernal Coleman is like stalking people like nasty liberal rag ProPublica or some version of that. And I mean,
And this is just the regular course of reporting. I mean, that's what you do. You talk to everybody, you knock on every door. So I think that there's a framing of sort of like, you know, regular reporting is somehow,
a
stop,
crime.
yeah, putting people in danger, which it's not.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Another question in the chat is the ICC or another international body looking into this stuff as a potential crime or violation of a treaty?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting question because, as I mentioned, that first story that we did about Panama, we really focused that story actually on the International Organization of Migration, which is, a UN body is supposed to facilitate safe and lawful migration, or safe migration, but is also funded mostly by the United States. And in this case of Panama, for example, was facilitating, the people's return, trying to facilitate the people's return from Panama, but some of them did not want to return. They said that they were asylum seekers, Iranians who were Christians and said that they were being persecuted, or, Russians who had other claims. And so I think the international organizations have been put in a very difficult position by some of these policies because, oftentimes they're sort of funded by the United States, but are also trying to, have safe migration. So I think that's one piece of it. I think the other piece there was some international claims made against El Salvador, and some interesting information came out of that because part of this arrangement in the same is that the United States, once the men were deported to El Salvador, they were making the claim that they were no longer in their jurisdiction. And even though they had made a deal with the Salvadoran government and were paying for their incarceration, they said that they had no control basically over what the Salvadoran government was done to them. They were outside of US territory. And this international claim that was made, which was an international claim of torture and, deprivation of liberty, the Salvadoran government at the United Nations, the Salvadoran government responded to that. And they said, no, we are holding these men, at the behest of the United States. So it was the two governments sort of trying to, point the finger at the other one of who was responsible for them. And, when the Venezuelan government came into the mix and there was this negotiated deal of a prisoner swap for Venezuelans, Americans, and legal permanent residents in Venezuela to go back to the United States in exchange for these prisoners, then it was sort of another level of, well, we wash our hands of this now. They've been released to Venezuela. And so it makes these types of claims difficult. There is an ongoing case right now where one of the men is trying to sue the United States for damages. I think there might be, ongoing efforts to hold El Salvador responsible. But in that prison, there's also hundreds of Salvadorans who are going through, similar treatment. So I think this is exactly the questions that this type of arrangement raises, sort of who is responsible, and is this the United States trying to kind of, shed their responsibility for these actions?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I think that's about all the time we have. It's just about 8 o'clock now. So I'll just say thank you for all of your amazing reporting. Thank you for sharing it with us, and for all the work that you're doing. And I'll also remind everyone who's watching that this presentation will go up on YouTube. So if folks want to take a look at all of the dense information that was shared in the last hour or so, that'll be up on YouTube for you. But yeah, Melissa and Micah, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. We're gonna head out. See ya.
All right. See you.